Hello. I believe we can begin. Welcome, everyone. My name is Eugenia Gusilov. I'm the director of the think tank Romania Energy Center, and on behalf of Roec, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you. Today is a big day for our think tank, and we couldn't have done it without the help from our partners. The Bucharest University of Economic Studies, the host of our event, who put at our disposal this beautiful aula, the Romanian US Alumni Association, and our media partners, of course. Today's event is part of the Roec Bucharest Talk Series, our latest project, which aims to engage the biggest names of our time in meaningful conversation on current affairs topics. At the same time, this event marks a milestone for Romania's think tank community, as it is the first time we have an American scholar engage with the audience in Bucharest and discuss a book which was launched in Washington, D.C. just 2 weeks ago. Right? 2 weeks ago. Professor Mearsheimer, we're absolutely thrilled to have you here, and thank you for accepting our invitation to talk about your latest book. A few more things before we begin. Our event will be live streamed, so I would like to greet our viewers online who will be tuning in and watching us. I would like to thank our partner Impro Media, who made that possible, and I would like to invite now the Vice Rector of the Bucharest University of Economic Studies, Professor Marius Profiroiu, to join me in welcoming you.
Good afternoon. Dear Professor Mearsheimer, dear guests, welcome to the Bucharest University of Economic Study. Welcome to Romania. I discussed with the professor 30 minutes about the transition in Romania, and so I'm so happy to know that we are still in transition in our university, but the will is correct in our view. I think our university, Bucharest University of Economic Studies, not only I think, but I believe, we are the most prestigious university in Romania in the field of economics, business, and public administration. We are founded more than 100 years ago, in 1913, by the King Carol, and now we have more than 22,000 students. We have more than 800 full professors, and we have now more than 200 partnerships around the world. And I'm so happy to say that now we have a new American Center University, we have partnership university with Chicago. I'm so happy to say that this summer we organized first time in Romania International Data Science Summer in Predal with a professor from Chicago, our Romanian professor Dan Nicolae, the Dean of the School of Statistics in Chicago, not only Chicago, also professor from University of Ohio, professor University of New York, and other professor from Europe. In fact, our strategy in our university is to be a real player in the global market of education. I think, and I believe, that education is a strategic tool for all the countries. And Romania, if you want to be part of this global market, we need people to understand what happened in this global world. And I think today, our distinguished guest will talk also about this. We passed more than 100 years, this university. We passed from the monarchy to the communism to capitalism. And I think for us it was very difficult, this transition period, for my professor, from my colleagues. But I think now, after 30 years, we think, with the help also with the think tank, like you, and congratulations, our university become more prominent in the international arena. Distinguished professor at Chicago University, with numerous academic and teaching honors at prestigious academic establishments all over the world. His articles and his 6 published books have shaped debate on the most relevant foreign and security affairs. We are honored to host Professor Mearsheimer today in a conversation about this latest book, The Great Delusion, Liberal Dreams and Internationalities. Please welcome Professor John Mearsheimer in our university. Thank you. Mulțumesc.
This will come up on this screen so people can see it. Thank you. Can everybody hear me clearly, especially in the back? There's no echo? Okay. Pardon? What? No, if I put the mic too close, it's not as clear. I think it's better if the mic's not near me, as long as people can hear.
But for the online?
For the online. I see. Okay. I'm going to have to go to great lengths not to talk too loud because the echo from the microphone is quite significant. It's a great pleasure to be here. I would like to thank the Romania Energy Center and the Bucharest University of Economic Studies for sponsoring my talk today. And I'd especially like to thank Eugenia Gusilov for making the arrangements for me being here today, and also for the talk I'm going to give tomorrow. And I'd like to acknowledge her sidekick, Eliza George, who helped Eugenia plan my visit. The subject I'm going to talk about today is my new book, The Great Delusion, Liberal Ideals and International Realities. Now, let me just see if I can make this work. There we go. Here's the basic story that I'm going to tell you today. The United States pursued liberal hegemony after the Cold War. And the basic aim was to remake the world in America's image. The policy failed miserably. And then the question is why? And my argument is that nationalism and realism trumped liberalism at every turn. This is really very much a story about the relationship between liberalism, nationalism, and realism. And the argument I make about liberalism should not be misinterpreted to mean that I am against liberalism as a political ideology. I thank my lucky stars every day that I was born in liberal America. The fact that I was born into a liberal democracy, I consider to be a great fortune. So I'm not arguing that liberal democracy as a political system for a particular country is a bad thing. In fact, I think the best political order one can possibly have is a liberal democracy. My argument is that there's a fundamental difference between liberalism at home and liberalism abroad. And that when you pursue a liberal foreign policy, you get yourself into a whole heck of a lot of trouble. And that's in large part because you run into nationalism and realism. Here's the basic outline of my talk. First, I'm going to define for you what I mean by liberalism. Then I'm going to define for you what I mean by nationalism. Then I'll tell you what liberal hegemony is, which is the foreign policy I argue the United States has pursued since 1989. Then I'll tell you why we, Americans, pursued this policy. I'll talk about what the track record looks like, how well it did. Then I'll talk about why it failed and what liberal hegemony's future is. So that's the basic outline of what I'm going to do. First, what's liberalism? Liberalism has two bedrock assumptions. It is individualistic at its core. Now you're saying to yourself, what exactly is he talking about? I believe that when you think about human beings, you have to ask yourself whether or not you believe that human beings are essentially social animals who carve out space for their individualism, or you believe that human beings are individuals who form social contracts. It's a very, very important distinction. And liberalism is predicated on the assumption that we are first and foremost individuals who form social contracts. And this is why the famous liberal theorists like John Locke are called social contract theorists, because they believe you start with the individual. And to get ahead of myself, nationalism is predicated on the assumption that we are all social animals from the beginning, and that we carve out space for our individualism along the way. We are very tribal from the get-go. It's a very different way of looking at the world than assuming we are first and foremost individuals who then come together to form social contracts. So that's the first thing you want to understand about liberalism. It's individualism. The second thing that you want to understand is that it assumes that individuals cannot reach universal agreement over first principles. They can't really agree about the big questions like abortion, affirmative action. And in fact, liberalism, in my opinion, got its start in Britain at a time when Catholics and Protestants were killing each other in large numbers. And the question is, how do you determine, using your critical faculties, using your ability to reason, whether Catholicism is superior to Protestantism or Protestantism is superior to Catholicism? How do you figure out what the answer to that one is? If you're in Germany in 1938, there are lots of people who like fascism, who think it's the best political system in the world. There are lots of people in the United States who think liberal democracy is the best political system in the world. How do you determine who's right? Using your critical faculties? I don't think so. So what liberalism starts with is the assumption that people oftentimes cannot agree about important issues, and those disagreements are so intense that they sometimes lead to violence. So the question that liberalism faces from the start is, how should politics be arranged to deal with this potential for violence? This is the central question that liberalism deals with. And the liberal solution is threefold. First of all, to place a very high premium on individual rights. Liberalism is all about rights, as I'm sure all of you know. And those rights are inalienable. That means that everybody on the planet has those rights. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They're not restricted to Americans in the Declaration of Independence. They apply to every person on the planet. Second part of the solution is to purvey the norm of tolerance. Tolerance is enormously important in the liberal story. And tolerance is important because you can't solve those disputes with your critical faculties to determine whether we should be Catholic or Protestant. And therefore, those people who want to be Catholic have to tolerate the Protestants, and the Protestants have to tolerate the Catholics. That's what liberalism is all about, preaching tolerance. And also, getting back to my first point, it's about individual rights. You have the right to be a Catholic. You have the right to be a Protestant. You have the right to be an atheist. And we're all tolerant of each other's particular views, even if we disagree with them. The third element of the solution is the state. And the reason you need a state is because tolerance only goes so far. And sometimes people are incapable of being tolerant, and they want to kill each other. So you have a state that acts as a night watchman. And if anybody misbehaves, the state comes in and deals with them accordingly. So again, you start with two assumptions. Individuals are what matter. It's an individualistic ideology. It assumes that individuals can't reach universal agreement. And then the question becomes, how do you organize politics to deal with these two issues? And you get individual rights that are inalienable, the norm of tolerance, and the state. Now here's the taproot of liberal hegemony. This is the key to understanding liberalism in foreign policy. Once you focus on individuals, not on tribes or social groups or nations, you focus on individuals, and you say that every individual on the planet has inalienable rights, you have, by definition, a universalistic ideology. It's an ideology that applies across the planet. You don't distinguish between Romanians and Americans. Americans and Romanians, that's nationalism. This is liberalism. The focus is on the individual. There's no significant difference between you as Romanians and me as an American. We are all individuals and we all have inalienable rights. That's the universalism. That's what really drives the train. That's what makes the United States of America, when it's thinking that way, so bent on reshaping the world in its own image. Talk a little bit about nationalism. Nationalism's core assumption: human beings are naturally social animals. They're born into and heavily socialized into particular groups. And individualism takes a back seat to group loyalty. And aside from the family, the most important group in today's world is the nation. There is this entity called the Romanian nation. There is this entity called the American nation. You are all very tribal. Everybody from where I come from is very tribal. Everybody on the planet is tribal. That's what nationalism is all about. The focus is not primarily on the individual. And when you think about the relationship between liberalism and nationalism, what you have to do is ask yourself the question, what do you think is the correct view of human nature? Are we all primarily social animals, or are we all primarily individuals? Here's my definition of nationalism. It's a set of political beliefs which holds that a nation, which is a body of individuals with characteristics that purportedly distinguish them from other groups, should have their own state. The word nation-state captures the essence of nationalism. The world is divided up into nations, and each nation should have its own state. Theodor Herzl, who is the father of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, father of Zionism, his great book was entitled The Jewish State. Just think about it, the Jewish state. He was saying Jews are a nation and they should have their own state. The Romanian state, the German state, the French state. Look around the world today. The world, the planet, is covered by nothing but nation states. What do the Palestinians want? They want their own nation state. What do the Catalonians want? They want their own nation state. You did not like being part of the Ottoman Empire. You wanted your own nation state. There's this tribe there called Romanians, and they wanted their own state. Talk a little bit about sovereignty. Nations place enormous importance on sovereignty or self-determination, which is why they want their own state. You don't want Russia telling you what to do. Don't you think you have a right, as members of a Romanian nation state, to determine your own fate? Isn't that what self-determination is all about, or sovereignty? You resist foreign interference. You go to the United States of America today, we're still terribly upset about the fact that the Russians supposedly interfered in our election in 2016 in a big way. Who are the Russians to interfere in our election? We're a sovereign state. It's all very important for when we start talking about liberal hegemony. Nationalism versus liberalism. Nationalism beats liberalism at every turn. Why is that? Human beings are primarily social animals. They're not first and foremost individuals who then form social contracts. We are all born into a society, and we are heavily socialized before our critical faculties kick in. And as I said to you on a number of occasions, if you look at the planet, it's covered by nothing but nation states. Liberal democracies have never comprised 50% of the states in the system, and the number of liberal democracies has actually been declining since 2006. The number of nation states is not declining. It's another way of saying all liberal democracies are liberal nation states. Okay, liberal hegemony. Now we're talking about American foreign policy. Liberal hegemony has three basic goals, and they all are pursued in support of an attempt to remake the world in America's image. This is what happened when the Cold War ended. The United States decided it was going to remake the world in its own image. And there are three components to the strategy. The first and most important, and that's why I put 3 stars next to it, is we're going to spread liberal democracy across the planet. Second, we're going to integrate more and more countries into the open international economy. And third, we're going to integrate more and more countries into international institutions. And let me give you an example of liberal hegemony at work. NATO expansion, EU expansion. NATO expansion, EU expansion is liberal hegemony at work. You loved it, by the way, right? What was the name of the game? The name of the game was to make Eastern Europe look like the United States of America. We wanted to turn you all into liberal democracies. We wanted Europe, all of Europe, to be filled with liberal democracies. By the way, the Bush Doctrine, when we invaded the Middle East, you understand our ultimate goal with the Bush Doctrine was to turn the Middle East into a sea of democracies. We're remaking the world in America's image. You, of course, like this. And I don't blame you one bit, because you remember what I said about liberal democracy. Best political system on the planet. Not perfect, but the best. But America wanted to make every country on the planet look like us. Second, we wanted to integrate more and more countries into the open international economy. EU expansion, there you go. Integrate more and more countries into international institutions. You wanted to be in the EU, right? We wanted to get you in the EU. You wanted to be NATO? You wanted to be in NATO? We wanted you to be in NATO. Those are the international institutions. Remember the Orange Revolution, the Rose Revolution? Go back to the first point. That's spreading democracy. What do we want to do with Ukraine? What do we want to do with Georgia? We want to get them in NATO. We wanted to get them in the EU. That's liberal hegemony at work. What are the benefits? 3 big benefits. First of all, you eliminate significant human rights violations because liberal democracies hardly ever violate the individual rights of their citizens in major ways. So if you create a planet that's filled with liberal democracies, you take the human rights problem right off the table. It's enormously important. And remember how important rights are in the liberal story. Remember, liberalism is a theory that prizes individual rights. Therefore, violating individual rights in authoritarian states is unacceptable from a liberal point of view because everybody on the planet has this set of rights. And the focus is on the individual, not on the tribe. So if you can take this problem off the table, eliminating human rights violations, you've really done something very good. Then a second benefit of liberal hegemony, which many of you know about, is you make for a more peaceful world. Because you know the liberal theory that liberal democracies don't fight each other. So if you create a world of liberal democracies that don't fight each other, you end up in a world of peace, love, and dope. The balance of power and realism is relegated to the dustbin of history. People like me are instant dinosaurs. Realism? Come on. And furthermore, if you're concerned about terrorism and nuclear proliferation, in a world that's remarkably peaceful, those problems are taken off the table. This is why Frank Fukuyama, who wrote this very famous article called The End of History, said at the end of the article that if this world comes into being, the greatest problem that we'll face is boredom. Just think about that. He said the greatest problem we'll face is boredom, because basically conflict is taken off the table. So first of all, you solve the human rights problem, violations of human rights. Number 2, you make for a more peaceful world, which has all sorts of positive consequences in terms of dealing with terrorism and dealing with nuclear proliferation. And then third, you make the world safe for liberal democracy, because there's no alternative system out there that people can turn to. And of course, liberal democracies always have groups inside them that are unhappy with liberal democracy and would like to do away with liberal democracy. We're seeing more and more of this in Europe today, and many would argue we're beginning to see it in the United States as well. Well, if those people inside a particular country don't have anybody to turn to for support, right? If communists inside the United States can't turn to the Soviet Union for outside support because the whole world is populated with nothing but liberal democracies, you help make the world safe for liberal democracy. So these were the benefits that we saw. Why did the U.S. pursue liberal hegemony? First point, which I cannot emphasize enough, is you have to be in a unipolar world. And this is why, starting with the end of the Cold War in 1989, the United States began to move towards pursuing liberal hegemony. And the reason is, if you're in a bipolar world or a multipolar world where you have other great powers, you have to pay attention to the balance of power, and you have to act in a realist way. In a unipolar world where there is only one great power, by definition, that one great power doesn't have to worry about competing with other great powers. So it's free to pursue a liberal foreign policy. So the point is that unipolarity was a permissive condition. It opened the door for us to pursue liberal hegemony. Now, the second reason we pursued liberal hegemony is that the United States is a profoundly liberal country. There's no getting around that. As a realist, I can tell you from all my experiences over the years in the United States that there are very few Americans who like realism. They love liberalism. And then finally, and this is quite paradoxical, American nationalism supplied an unhealthy dose of hubris to the equation. Madeleine Albright is a card-carrying liberal hegemonist. She is a thoroughgoing liberal when it comes to foreign policy. She's also a nationalist of the first order. She's an American nationalist. We never talk like this in the United States. Nationalism is a word that's hardly ever used to describe Americans. We self-identify as liberals, not nationalists. But we are all nationalists because, as I told you, nationalism is the most powerful political ideology on the planet, and it applies to the United States as well as Romania, as well as Russia, as well as Germany, as well as Japan. What are Madeleine Albright's most famous words? Madeleine Albright said, when asked why the United States intervenes all over the world, she said, "We are the indispensable nation. We stand taller and we see further." Just think about those words. We as opposed to the other. We stand taller and we see further. We are better than others. We meaning the Americans, right? And then she said, we are the indispensable nation. There's the word, nation. We are the indispensable nation. We as opposed to the other are indispensable. We are smarter, we are better than other nations. That's nationalism. American exceptionalism, any American politician who denies American exceptionalism is going to get him or herself into a lot of trouble. American exceptionalism is pure, unadulterated nationalism. So that sense of hubris that comes from nationalism, coupled with the profound influence that liberalism has in the American body politic, combined with the fact that we were in the unipolar moment, allowed us to pursue liberal hegemony. What happened? Disasters. First of all, the Bush Doctrine and the Greater Middle East. As I said to you before, the Bush Doctrine was designed to democratize the Middle East. When we invaded Iraq, Iraq was envisioned as only the first stop on the railroad line. We were then going to do Syria, maybe do Iran. We were going to democratize the entire region. It was a colossal failure. The amount of murder and mayhem that we have created in the Middle East is truly stunning. Just think Libya, think Syria, think Iraq, think Afghanistan, think what we're doing in Yemen now. Hard to believe, the murder and mayhem. The Bush Doctrine was a failure. What about the Ukraine crisis? Most of you surely believe that the Russians are principally responsible for the Ukraine crisis. It was the evil Russians who caused this crisis. How else could this have happened? That's wrong in my opinion. We meaning the West, created the Ukraine crisis because we marched NATO, the EU, right up to Russia's doorsteps. Despite their protests, they kept telling us that sooner or later this is going to blow up in your face. The idea that you Americans can take a military alliance that was a mortal enemy of the Soviet Union during the Cold War and put it right on our borders is unacceptable. Not going to happen. You Americans have the Monroe Doctrine. You don't let other great powers come into your backyard. We're not going to let other great powers come into our backyard. And of course, we were fostering revolutions, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine and the Rose Revolution in Georgia, and we were hinting that Putin was next. You seriously think that Vladimir Putin was going to stand by and allow that to happen? You know how the United States goes ballistic when the Russians interfere in our domestic politics? You don't think the Russians are going to go ballistic when we interfere in their politics? You don't think Vladimir Putin is going to punch back when you start talking about marching NATO right up to his border? You don't think that Vladimir Putin is going to punch back when you start threatening to topple his regime and democratize Russia? And it's not just Russia. Go to China, go to Beijing, and talk to the Chinese how they think about American interference in Chinese politics, and you'll get the same story. They don't like it at all. And they don't like those American ships and those American aircraft going up and down the coast of China. Is this surprising? As an American who privileges the Monroe Doctrine and who does not like the idea of great powers from Asia or great powers from Europe interfering in the Western Hemisphere, I can fully appreciate why the Russians don't want NATO on their border. But that's what we did. And we did not do it for realpolitik reasons. Most of you young people in the audience probably think that we marched NATO eastward because we were worried about the Russian threat. On the contrary, there was hardly any talk about a Russian threat. NATO was moved eastward, the EU was moved eastward, and we promoted these revolutions as part of a non-realist agenda, as part of a policy called liberal hegemony. And in fact, Madeleine Albright and Michael McFaul, who was the US ambassador to Russia from 2012 to 2014, both told Putin on countless occasions that NATO expansion was not directed at Russia, that we did not view Russia as a military threat. We invented that myth after February 22nd, 2014, when the crisis broke out. This was liberal hegemony at its worst. And now we have a massive problem with the Russians. Finally, and I won't say much about this, there's the failure of engagement with China. The United States, as it watched China continue to grow, decided that it would engage with China, that we would do everything we can to integrate China into the open international economy, would get them deeply embedded and invested in international institutions, and the end result would be that we would democratize China. China would turn into a liberal democracy. That would mean China would look like the United States, and if all the countries on the planet look like the United States, we would all live happily ever after, because we're the good guys, and if everybody looks like us, ergo, peace, love, and dope. That failed. Virtually everybody now agrees that there is an intense security competition brewing between the United States and China. Why did liberal hegemony fail? Power of nationalism, overselling of individual rights, power of realism, and illiberal liberalism. Let me just say a few words about all of these factors, just on the power of nationalism. The idea that the United States can run around the world and interfere in the politics of other countries and do it in a way that doesn't cause a blowback is a pipe dream. It's not going to happen. And when you invade a country and occupy a country, as we did with Iraq, and as we did with Afghanistan, the end result is that you find yourself facing an insurgency. When I was young, we fought the Vietnam War. I was in the American military from 1965 to 1975, which was coterminous with the Vietnam War. The American commitment to Vietnam, the buildup began in March 1965, and we lost the war in 1975. From 65 to 75, the United States did everything it could to win that war, and it couldn't. And the reason was the Vietnamese wanted to run their own country. We were up against nationalism. The Vietnamese were willing to die in huge numbers for their sovereignty. They did not want us interfering in their politics. When we invaded Afghanistan, we briefly defeated the Taliban. They came back from the dead, and now we face a major league insurgency there. Furthermore, with regard to the Russians and the Chinese, as I said to you before, the Russians and the Chinese don't want us telling them what kind of political system they should have, any more than we want them telling us what kind of political system we should have. Then there's the overselling of individual rights. The fact is, in many places on the planet, people don't care that much about rights. It's not to say they don't care, but they don't care that much. Go to Russia today, and you talk about liberal democracy. Russians identify liberal democracy with the 1990s, when Russia was the Wild West. It was a terrible period in Russian history. They'll take Putin, not everyone, but most people will take Putin and the security that he's created in Russia over the Wild West that you had in the 1990s, which they identify with liberal democracy. You might disagree with that, but the fact of the matter is there are a lot of people in Russia who are much more interested in stability and in security than they are in individual rights. So this tells you when you go into a lot of countries, individual rights are not that important. That means selling liberalism is not that easy. Then we come to the power of realism. This is the story I told you about NATO expansion. Vladimir Putin was operating according to the realist playbook. He had no intention of letting NATO expand up to Russia's borders. The Russians are basically wrecking Ukraine. The Russians have basically sent a simple message to the West and a simple message to Ukraine, which is that if you continue to persist in trying to integrate Ukraine into the Western orbit, we'll wreck Ukraine. We'll make it impossible for that to happen. That's Realpolitik 101. Liberal hegemony's future. This is the last part of my talk. The end of liberal hegemony. Donald Trump ran against liberal hegemony. It's very important to understand this. Donald Trump ran against, in 2016, all the key elements of that particular foreign policy. He said, number one, the United States is getting out of the business of spreading liberal democracy. And as you know, Donald Trump is very comfortable cavorting with authoritarian leaders and dictators. Number two, he is very unhappy about the open international economy, and he has demonstrated since he moved into the White House in January 2017 that he likes to slap tariffs not only on countries that are adversaries of the United States, but America's allies as well, which is contrary to what you do when you're promoting an open international economy. Furthermore, he does not like institutions at all. He said NATO is obsolete. He loathes the EU. He loathes the World Trade Organization. He does not like our alliances in East Asia with South Korea and Japan. NAFTA, he killed it. One of the first things he did when he came in office, foolishly in my opinion, was he killed the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This guy's never seen an institution he didn't loathe. You just want to think about what that means. We're talking about somebody who was elected, who number one, was not interested in spreading democracy around the world. Number two, was opposed in some fundamental ways to the open international economy. And number three, does not like international institutions, at least all the ones that existed when he moved into the White House. But I don't think that mattered. Liberal hegemony is basically all over with because of the rise of China and the resurrection of Russian power. Remember what I said to you in the beginning of the talk. It is absolutely essential to have unipolarity, to pursue a policy of liberal hegemony. Once you have multipolarity or bipolarity, once you have more than one great power in the system, and here we're talking about three great powers in the system, Russia, China, and the United States, those countries have to compete with each other. And they're therefore not free to pursue a liberal foreign policy. So my basic view here is that liberal hegemony has come to an end. And it's not because of Donald Trump, although Donald Trump certainly did run against liberal hegemony and was elected, but it's in large part because of the rise of China and the resurrection of Russian power. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Mearsheimer, for this fascinating talk. You raised a lot of issues. Now, before we open up for questions from the audience, I'd like to get a round of reactions and first questions from the panel. And for this next stage, I have enlisted the help of three great minds from three different generations. And I will make the introduction starting from the other side of the table. And I will start with Eliza Gheorghe, who is a professor of international relations at Bilkent University and a member of the Roec's Board of Advisors, who flew all the way from Turkey to be with us here today. Next to her, we have Andrei Țărnea, Commissioner for the France-Romania season 2019, Romanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and a former Executive Director at the Aspen Institute, Romania. And next to me, I have Ambassador Sergiu Celac, a career diplomat and a former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Romania. As a moderator, I would like to defer the privilege of asking the first question to Ambassador Celac.
Well, Professor, I hope you will excuse me, and I beg the audience to forgive me for speaking from a seating position, but I had a little accident with my leg yesterday, and I'm grateful if you let me sit while talking. I have, in fact, two questions and a brief comment. Let me get the comment out of the way first. There are many things that on which I agree with Professor Mearsheimer, including his brilliant definitions of the three motive forces of politics: nationalism, liberalism, and realism. And I think, and that is in fact my first question, we would all greatly appreciate if you gave us a sort of a definition, if this is not too presumptuous, of populism, the new ghost haunting Europe, and not only Europe, with the direct effects and the considerable fallout in international politics as well. But my comment is that there are, apart from many points of agreement, at least two on which I beg to differ. One concerns the responsibility of the West for what happened in Ukraine. We are neighbors of both Russia and Ukraine. For us in Romania, looking at the Kremlin is not a pleasant pastime or an exercise in intellectual curiosity. It is a matter of survival. And you used, in your book, you used the word survival several times.
Many times.
Yeah. Because as a Romanian and with some knowledge of Romanian history and history of diplomacy, I would say that survival, the ambition to survive, has been a constant feature since the establishment of the first early state formation on Romanian land. Just imagine, Professor, that Ukrainians officially ask Russia to leave Crimea, according to international law. Will they oblige? Unlikely. But the Iraqi government, once it was formed, asked the United States to leave Iraq in a military sense. And the United States obliged. So I see some sort of asymmetric responses to a sort of symmetric to symmetric situation. Secondly, I have noted your doubts and your quotation from George Kennan concerning the lack of wisdom in deciding NATO enlargement eastwards. However, in your book, you make it clear that the regime changes in Eastern Europe have not been the result of deliberate liberal export of liberalism from the US and the Western world into that region to which Romania belongs. You actually say in your book that it was the decision of those countries, or people in those countries, or political forces in those countries, to shake not only the communist regime, but also the Soviet and then Russian domination of their respective countries. Why not extend the same courtesy to Ukrainians? Because if you look at the facts on the ground, not just press reports or some ideological considerations, the Western interference in the development of events in Ukraine was physically minimal. There was support, there were some vocal statements by politicians and in the media, but nothing compared to the military occupation of the territory, of a portion, a sizable portion, of another country's territory. I would just say that from the Romanian perspective, or a Romanian perspective, for us, it is as simple as that. We need the European Union for prosperity and for its values, including political values. And we need the United States for security because nobody else is in a position to provide it. And it is not a matter of choice because the alternatives are new, are non-existent. So we either join and become an increasingly active members in those two multilateral arrangements, or we don't survive. And we don't relish the prospect of not surviving. In addition to the question about a possible definition of populism as the new game in town, my other question regards your ideas and your correct and wise criticism of dreams about a global state. As a professional of diplomacy, I don't see realistic prospects in that direction. But wouldn't you agree that we have already entered a period of transition to a different international order? And that the process of that transition has begun. It is now a work in progress. And it is driven by, at least in part, by forces that simply did not exist before that. The power of technology, the new tools of communication, the internet, the social networks, are reshaping international affairs. And we are already halfway to something else, which hopefully will not be a global state, a world state, but something else. Would you speculate on what else it could be? And just for your use, Professor Saab, the power of nationalism as an idea and a motive force in politics became very clear to me when I visited the History Museum in Hanoi. The History Museum in Hanoi has 3 sections. One was the resistance against the Chinese. The other is the Vietnamese resistance against French colonialists. And the third was the Vietnamese resistance against the Americans, with Chinese help, and in the case of resistance against the French, with American help. So this illustrates how strong it is. And as of, to illustrate your thesis about the futility or lack of realism of a global state or of any effort to establish one, although much of my work in diplomacy was in multilateral diplomacy, UN, OSCE, and so on. I would say that the best description of a future perfect world order is to be found in a series of 5 plays by George Bernard Shaw, which to my knowledge have never been played on stage, and which is entitled Back to Methuselah. And the final of those 5 plays, starting with Lilith and Adam and Eve, is about the perfect society of the future in which every métier, every job, is collectively performed by the nation which is best at that respective job. The British are bobbies, the Germans are mechanics, the Russians sing in choirs and set up military parades, the Italians are Latin lovers and they sing canzonetas, and all these beautiful, perfectly oiled world mechanisms is administered wisely and respectfully by the Chinese. Thank you, Professor.
Would you like to respond now, or we can take more?
Why doesn't everybody go, and then I'll respond.
Then I would like, why should not we continue with you, Elisa? Georgi, if you would like to jump in. You told me an interesting thing about a book. When we were discussing it, you told me that this is not a typical John Mearsheimer book. Would you care to develop this thought for us.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Professor Mearsheimer, for a fascinating talk and for producing what I think is going to be one of the most important books in the field in the next decades. I had 3 questions for you. The first one has to do with the intellectual journey that took you to this triptych, to the fact that you added nationalism, which is not necessarily an international relations theory in the same way that liberalism and realism are. And so how was it, why was it that you had to bring this into the picture? And if you think about the fact that nationalism has to do with ideas, coming from a realist, that I found that to be very striking, very surprising. Nationalism doesn't have so much to do with material capabilities. So I wondered what prompted you to go in that direction. Then the other question I had deals with the battle or the fight, the tension between realism and nationalism. On page 82, you mentioned that when liberalism is at odds with nationalism, nationalism wins almost every time. Now, you don't discuss as much those situations where nationalism and realism are at odds. Which one wins? And I think this is particularly pertinent to be discussed in Romania, a country where nationalist communism was a state ideology and carried us forward for a number of decades. And so when you, for instance, talk about how a small country like Romania or a small country like Georgia, like Moldova, they don't really have the right to advance their interest or to really pursue their national interests because we live in a bad neighborhood, I wonder to what extent nationalism could mitigate or compensate for our lack of military material capabilities. I'm not saying that I endorse that position. I'm just wondering what you would think about that. And then my last question has to do with your analysis of liberal hegemony and its rise at the beginning or in the unipolar age. It seems to me that liberal hegemony is to a certain extent overdetermined. What do I mean by that? You're talking about how the structure was very permissive for liberal hegemony to take roots and to flourish, but then you also mentioned that American nationalism, and your quote from Madeleine Albright was really on point in this respect. Nationalism was also a factor that led to this embrace of liberal hegemony. So what kind of conditions would have permitted or enabled realism to prevail? Because in the past you have written many articles and you have talked at great length about how the US was mistaken to take the route it took, and you obviously emphasized this in your book. But it seems to me that realism really had the odds stacked against itself, against it. So I'm curious to know how you think realism would have been a possible and a feasible alternative. Thank you.
Andrei Țărnea, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, with great pleasure. I'm going to speak from the angle of the practitioner rather than that of the theoretician, though some of my former students are in the hall, so I salute them. To some degree, liberal hegemony never existed. It's entirely a theoretical concept. So, just to pick up on what you last said, if we take a famous quote in the middle of the Ukrainian crisis that made the first page of news and the internet, and I'm referring to the specific utterance of Victoria Nuland, That's maybe a typical example that what we usually call liberal hegemony is a figment of our imagination. And it was in fact a coherent policy of a nation state and its allies, both domestically and abroad, in an interplay of domestic and foreign policy that had certain effects that we now, in retrospect, relabel and we play with them. Theoretically, it's coherent, but in practice, it doesn't stand the test of actual, if you want, theoretical underpinning of the policy-making process. The one thing that I believe is to some degree missing in the book is the analysis of method, of practice of policymaking and policy implementation. And one of the phrases that you used repeatedly in the book is that liberal internationalism or a policy failed miserably. But in fact, you can twist that around and say that, in fact, policy miserably failed liberalism in a sense of, as much as we're talking about an ideology or a coherent ideology that has, as you explain it in the first part of the book, domestic underpinnings, domestic beliefs that turn into political action. The other element that to some degree is missing is the personal decision-making element that is involved inevitably and that Ambassador Chelak alluded to in his intervention. A book that you're familiar with, Philip Zeliko's Essence of Decision, discusses to great length an episode of international importance, of global importance, the Cuban Missile Crisis, in terms that have less to do with the global theoretical framework of realism or liberalism or institutional liberalism or whatever you want to call them, but rather the processes through which decision makers, captive on both sides, in their own bubble of groupthink, made practical decisions that had global implications, in that case, averting a nuclear war. So in that respect, I think we're maybe overemphasizing the ideological element, and we're giving little or no attention to the element that has to do with both the human, in a sense of decision makers element in the process, and the fact that, as you well mentioned, states Russia as Ukraine, Romania as United States operate as nations, and thus nationalism in that sense of the term, less the domestic ideology that we call nationalism, operates as well. And the question that arises from that is, if we give up the idea that a form of institutionalism, hence a form of liberal theory underpinning international norms and international objectives, collective objectives of nation states is even possible or desirable, we're probably framing ourselves for another failure. We've seen, since the book was not published, but since it was presented for publishing, as you mentioned in several interviews, decisions of the Trump administrations have took a sledgehammer to some of the critical pillars, some of them established with a very realist objective, including in areas like nuclear non-proliferation or treaties specifically designed to make it more difficult for a nation state and nationalism expression of power to create havoc in the form of nuclear war. Last night I was at the launch of a product, and that's the final comment, by a multinational Chinese company. 2 of its suppliers are European companies, 3 of its main contributors are American companies. About half of the total value and 2/3 of the profits go to those companies. And it's a Chinese product. In a sense, if I started by saying that liberal hegemony never existed, it already won. Because while the United States dismantles some of those, or rather the current administration of the United States dismantles some of those international treaties that are the underpinning of an international legal order that we define as liberal, other countries are picking up the baton and they're continuing it, whether they're going to be successful or not, without the United States, which remains and will remain for the next decades the main military and economic power of the world. It's a separate question. Thank you.
Would you like to respond now, or can I add? I have a couple of questions myself.
You have my permission.
Okay, only one. Well, two. First of all, in your presentation today, and also in the book, you say this interesting thing, and I quote, "Within countries, I believe liberalism is a genuine force for good. I consider myself especially fortunate to have been born and lived all my life in liberal America, but liberalism at international level, however, is a different matter." So, would it be fair to say that you're a principled realist?
That I'm what?
That you're a principled realist? This is the first one, and the second one, I will just add to what Ambassador Chelak said at the beginning. In your book, you critique the post-Cold War U.S. foreign policy. You call it liberal hegemony. But for instance, if we were to talk about my country, Romania, we are now better off precisely due to the U.S. liberal foreign policy. We have rejoined the transatlantic community after much struggle. We are now members of NATO, which is the bedrock of our security, and of the EU, which offers us, as Ambassador Chelak said, solid framework for economic growth. So two institutions of the liberal world order created after the Second World War, which we joined very late. But this NATO and EU membership for Romania is like the holy of holy of our academic, elite, foreign policy, military establishment thinking. So I would say that the US foreign policy did not bring only misery, but also created security and prosperity. And we, Romanians, are living proof of that, despite the many problems that we still have, and our democracy is still work in progress.
I appreciate all these questions. The problem I face is that there are a lot of questions, and they're excellent questions. So I'm not going to be able to answer all of them, and certainly none of them in great detail. So I'll do my best to cover the waterfront. Starting with the ambassador's questions, I'm going to ignore the question of populism, in large part because I don't have a good answer to your question. I'm somewhat embarrassed to say that, but I'm not clear in my own head what exactly I think populism is and how it relates to nationalism. Instead of trying to dance around up here, it's just better if I leave that for another day because of my ignorance. Let me focus on your comments about Ukraine for the most part, the Ukraine crisis. I want to be very clear that when you were talking about Ukraine, you started talking about Romania and how Romania thinks about the Russian threat. My comments about the Ukraine crisis and what caused it had nothing to do with Romania. You said that when Romanians look at, when they look at Russia, they think about their survival. And I fully understand that. And I fully understand, by the way, why Romanians want to be part of NATO. I think from a Romanian point of view, your principal foreign policy goal for the foreseeable future should be to maintain an American military presence in Europe and to maintain NATO and make sure that Romania is firmly ensconced in NATO. So I'm not talking at all about Romania when I talk about the Ukraine crisis. Now, let me just make a couple points about that. First of all, you said that with regard to international law, the Russians violated international law when they went in and took the Crimea. And the Americans, on the other hand, when they were asked to leave Iraq, in keeping with international law, left Iraq. The United States violates international law all the time. The invasion of Iraq was a violation of international law. What we did in Libya was a violation of international law. The point I would make is that great powers, when they think their interests are threatened, don't pay attention to international law. And it would be crazy for a country like Romania to put great stock in international law. International law is not going to save you if you get into trouble with a great power, because great powers do whatever they think is in their interests. And you talked about extending a certain courtesy to Ukraine, and I think that what you were talking about is recognizing the fact that Ukraine, as a sovereign state, has the right to decide its own foreign policy. Most of you, I'm sure, believe that Ukraine has a right to join the West if it wants to do so, because it's a Ukrainian, because it is a sovereign state. I think this is a fundamentally foolish way of thinking about international politics. If you live next door to a great power, you do not have the right to just do whatever you want in foreign policy. Because if that great power thinks you don't have the right, it will crush you. Do you really think that countries in the Western Hemisphere have the right to choose any foreign policy that they want? They don't. The United States would go ballistic if any country in the Western Hemisphere decided that it was going to pursue a foreign policy that threatened the American national interest. This is what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Great powers are paranoid about their borders. They're paranoid about their security. And if you're a minor power and you live near a great power, you have to be extremely careful. And the problem in the case of Ukraine is that because of Western policies, the Russians got spooked. And when the Russians got spooked, they went to great lengths to intervene in Ukraine and make sure that Ukraine never becomes a Western bulwark on their border. And I believe that what the United States and its European allies did was they led the Ukrainians down the primrose path. They encouraged the Ukrainians to think that they had the right to pursue any foreign policy that they wanted. They led the Georgians to think the same way. And in fact, the Russians did not agree with that assessment, and the Russians went to war in August 2008 over Georgia, and they went to war after February 22nd, 2014 over Ukraine. And in both cases, they'll wreck those countries before they let them become part of the West. So that's why I think it was just such a mistake for the West to say here in Bucharest, the trouble started here in Bucharest, by the way, in April 2008, in the wake of the NATO summit, when NATO issued a declaration saying that Georgia and Ukraine would become part of NATO. The Russians made it very clear at the time that you have crossed a red line. But of course, people in the West didn't listen. The ambassador also raised a very interesting issue, and that's whether or not we are in the midst of a transformation in the nature of the international system. And he focused on the power of technological change. And his basic point was that although we may not be moving to a world state, international politics is changing in important ways. I respectfully disagree completely with that perspective. And my view is that the international system is not changing. The international system is comprised of nation states, and those nation states operate in an anarchic system. That is to say, they have no higher authority above them. In my opinion, the nation state is not going away. as I said to you in my comments from the lectern, nationalism is the most powerful political ideology on the planet. Nationalism is all about the nation state. The nation state is here to stay. The nation state is going to exist in an anarchic environment. And for me, that means that the essence of international politics is not going to change. This is not to say that technological changes don't matter, but in fact, I think the most important technological development of modern times that has profoundly affected international politics is the development of nuclear weapons. And if you want to make an argument that international politics has fundamentally changed in the past century, I think you'd want to rivet on nuclear weapons. But even there, I don't think the basic nature of international politics changed. With regard to Eliza's questions, first of all, she asked me why did I deal with nationalism in this book when in the past I had largely ignored nationalism and focused mainly on realism but also on liberalism. And she's of course correct that in the past I wrote about realism and liberalism and said hardly anything about nationalism. In a funny way, I thought it was time to say something about nationalism because even though I had not written about it, I did believe it was the most powerful political ideology on the planet. And as I said to you in describing my youthful experiences in the American military, I came to appreciate, as a result of the Vietnam War, just how powerful a force nationalism is. And I always thought that I should write something about it. And I thought it would be very interesting to talk about the relationship between these three isms, nationalism, liberalism, and realism. And nobody else had done that. So that was sort of what drove me in this direction. Now, she raises the point in her second question that I don't say much about realism and nationalism, right? And if you think about the way I've structured the book focuses on liberalism, liberal hegemony, and then what happens when liberal hegemony runs up against nationalism, and when liberalism or liberal hegemony runs up against realism. So those two relationships, liberalism and realism, liberalism and nationalism. And she's saying, what about nationalism and realism? But I, of course, am not focusing on that because I'm focusing on liberalism and how it relates to those two. Let me say a few words. First of all, I think that nationalism and liberalism do not clash very often, right? I think that they... Sorry, yeah, right. Nationalism and realism, sorry. Yeah, I don't think that nationalism and realism clash very often, right? I think they sometimes do when nationalism gets out of control, right? That nationalist fervor is so powerful in a particular country that it forces leaders to pursue foolish policies. And to pick up on this, I'll say a few words about China. If you talk to Chinese scholars about how the Chinese government is playing the nationalism card these days, the Chinese government is playing the nationalism card big time because the Chinese government has a legitimacy problem. Communism is not a really legitimate ideology, and they're not democratically elected leaders in China. So nationalism has become an important way for the elites, the governing elites, to maintain their position. And they emphasize the century of national humiliation. If you look at the literature on Chinese nationalism, it focuses on the century of national humiliation and who humiliated the Chinese. It was first the Japanese and second the Americans. And Chinese academics and Chinese policymakers who I know will tell you that they worry that a crisis will break out between Japan and China or between the United States and China, and nationalism will kick in, and the end result is that tremendous pressure from below because of nationalism, will be put on the governing elites to go to war against Japan or to go to war against the United States, even though the elites don't want to do it. It's sort of letting the genie out of the bottle. I raise this example because it gets to Eliza's point or question: are there instances where nationalism and realism actually clash with each other that I don't discuss? And I don't discuss that, as she pointed out, and that's an example of where they clash. But my more general point to you would be that they usually don't clash. She also raised a very interesting question of whether nationalism can be a substitute for not having sufficient military capabilities. You know, if you're a country like Romania and you don't have a huge army, can you use nationalism as a force multiplier? That's a word we use in the United States. It's a force multiplier. I think the answer is that nationalism can be a huge force multiplier because what nationalism does, it creates tremendous loyalty among the citizenry and among the troops to the state, and it makes people willing to fight and die in large numbers. The ambassador talked about the museum in Hanoi. That museum in Hanoi was all about nationalism, right? And nationalism was a huge force multiplier for the Vietnamese. They were willing to fight and die in enormous numbers to win their independence, as the ambassador pointed out, from the French, from the Chinese, from the Americans, and I would add from the Japanese during World War II as well, right? So nationalism can be a huge force multiplier. But there's also, I just want to be very clear here, no substitute for having a huge army. The best thing that could happen to Romania is that it could grow to be about 20 times as big as it is now in terms of population size and wealth. The best situation that Romania could find itself in is one where it is by far the most powerful state in all of Europe. Then you wouldn't have to worry about your survival, at least in this neighborhood. So in the final analysis, there's no substitute for having large numbers of big battalions. But on top of that, you do want nationalism as a force multiplier. Then I will go to Andre's points. Andre said that he thought that was liberal hegemony, as I laid it out, is theoretically coherent. He applauded me on that front. He said it's theoretically coherent, but in practice, it doesn't really tell you very much about the world. The way I think about theory is that we need theory because the world is incredibly complicated and we can't make sense of it without theories. Theories are simplifications of reality. John gets up there and he gives you a talk about what liberalism is, and it's a very simple story. Most of you, I'm sure, had no trouble following my arguments because my arguments are very simple. But the world is incredibly complicated. But again, the reason we need simple theories is to make sense of that complicated world, okay? So when you tell me that I have a nice, coherent, and simple theory, right, but it doesn't really do a great job explaining how the world works, I'm somewhat sympathetic to that because that's true of theory in general, okay? However, I do disagree with you in that I think it explains more about the real world than you do. And I think if you look at the Bush doctrine, let's stay away from the Ukraine crisis, but if you look at the Bush doctrine and you read what George Bush was saying and what his lieutenants were saying at the time when they formulated that doctrine and when they went into Iraq and then in the aftermath, right? I think you see lots of evidence that liberal hegemony was at play here, right? And that the theory does tell you, I'm choosing my words very carefully here, that the theory does tell you quite a bit about what happened in Iraq. But it doesn't tell you everything for the reasons that he was alluding to, that the world is incredibly complicated. He also pointed out that one thing he didn't like about my talk and my book is that I didn't place enough emphasis on decision-making, that the decision-making element really matters in foreign policy. First of all, he's right that I don't pay attention to decision-making. This is not a book about decision-making. You referenced the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Graham Allison and Philip Zelikow book. That's all about decision-making in the Cuban Missile Crisis. My book is not about decision-making. My book is about the policies that result from decision-making. And I don't deny that you could write a book on the decision-making process that led to liberal hegemony. But I didn't do that. All I did was look at the policies. And as you well know, there are limits to what you can do when you write a book. And I just didn't have time to do that. But you, of course, can do that by writing a book on the subject. But I just didn't do it. But again, that's just the limits of the academic enterprise. Let me say a few words about one of your other points. That's about China. You said that Donald Trump is taking the sledgehammer and wrecking the liberal international order, and that China is picking up the baton in part. First point I would make is that, remember, my argument is not so much that Trump is really responsible for what's happening to the liberal international order or what's happening to liberal hegemony. It's the rise of China, right? And that with the rise of China, liberal hegemony is finished. It's just no longer a viable foreign policy. And this is because I believe that it's impossible in a world of two or more great powers for the United States to pursue liberal hegemony. So it's just all over with. And Trump does matter, but he doesn't matter that much. Let me go to Eugenia's 2 points. First of all, she said that I'm a principled realist. I like to think that I'm a principled person. I really do. Leave aside the realism. I do like to think that I'm a principled person. I'm not too sure what it means to be a principled realist, because the word principle is usually associated with morality. And I think it's important to understand that realism is not an immoral theory or ideology or foreign policy, but it is amoral. Realism basically says that what matters is the balance of power, and you do what you have to do to maintain your position in the balance of power. And sometimes that involves doing terrible things. Not often, but sometimes it does. So when you talk about being a principled realist, it's almost a contradiction in terms, right? This is not to say that you want to go around the world creating murder and mayhem. And you all understand, by the way, in the context of the United States, the realists are the main group that opposes America's wars. You understand I was one of the leading opponents of the Iraq War, and in opposing the foreign policy of liberal hegemony, I'm calling for the United States to pursue a much more restrained foreign policy. I often say when I go around, Do you realize that the United States has been at war for 2 out of every 3 years since the Cold War ended? Do you realize that the United States has fought 7 different wars since the Cold War ended? The United States is addicted to war. I'm opposed to this. So I'm not a militarist. And again, I oppose the Iraq War. I oppose what we did in Syria. I oppose what we did in Libya. Last thing I want to do is go to war against Iran. Right? So realists tend to favor foreign policies of restraint. So it's not like we're interested in running around the world starting wars and killing lots of people. But to say that you're a principled realist, I think is a contradiction in terms, as much as I hate to say that. Finally, your point about Romania and what's happened to Romania as a consequence of liberal hegemony is absolutely correct. It's a fascinating point. She is saying that Romania has been the beneficiary of this foreign policy called liberal hegemony, which John says is a remarkably foolish policy. That's what she's saying. And she's correct. But I still think it was a remarkably foolish policy because the amount of trouble that it caused, not only for the United States, for people around the world as well, outweighs the good that it did. But I do not deny for 1 second that Romania benefited greatly from this policy. And as I said before, my basic view with regard to Romanian foreign policy is that your principal goal should be to keep the Americans in Europe, keep NATO intact, make sure you remain in NATO, and number 2, don't do anything unnecessary to provoke the Russians, because any time you live next door to an 800-pound gorilla, you have to make sure that you don't do anything that needlessly provokes that gorilla. Thank you.
Thank you for answering all of our questions. We fired away everything we had, in the panel. Well, we have a couple of questions more, but I would like to give the audience the chance to ask you questions. And we have a mic. Stefania, where are you?
You need that for them.
Well, let's see. We have a gentleman over here. No, over here. Let's start.
Thank you. My name is Octavian Jora. I'm associate professor in this distinguished university and also founder and editor-in-chief of the Market for Ideas magazine. My question deals with something that bothers me equally as a scholar and as a journalist. I always thought that being relevant, not necessarily eminent, in the study of human relations, international relations in this case, does need, first and foremost, a fair representation of reality. And a fair representation of reality has, in my opinion, 2 necessary allies: a good command of logic and a fair sense of language. I want to ask you, as a political scientist, where do you think that politically correctness stands in relation to this fair representation of reality in international relations or wherever else? Is political correctness a device meant to soften or smoothen our discourse, or is a device meant to entrap and imprison our mind? Thank you.
Should we take a couple more questions, or you would like to respond to each?
Why don't you take a couple questions?
A couple of questions, okay. Back, Mrs. Alina Inaev.
Alina Inaev with the German Marshall Fund. I have 2 questions. You conclude that the liberal hegemony has failed. What has failed, the liberal part of it or the hegemony part of it? In other words, you understand my question, but have the liberal values failed on us, or the way we go about it, went about it, or you went about it as Americans, has failed on us? And the second question At one point on your PowerPoint presentation, you had United States is a profoundly liberal country. And I didn't understand if you agreed with this assumption or if you disagreed with this assumption.
Could you repeat that, please?
On your PowerPoint presentation, you had that United States is a profoundly liberal country. Do you agree with it or you disagree with it? Because I didn't get it from the presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Let's be fair and take a question from this side of the room.
Yeah, thank you. I am an associate professor with the Academy of Economic Studies. It's a privilege of having you here. My question is quite simple. There are some other failures in our modern history of liberal international order. Would you compare this period that we are going to experience from now on with the post-Vienna or the post-1815 international system? What do you think? Thank you.
And one more from this side, just to have a fair balance, 2 and 2.
Hello, I'm Radu Ungureanu from the National University of Political Studies and Public Administration. You've mentioned, I have to say that I didn't read your book yet, but you've mentioned in your presentation something about illiberal liberalism. What do you mean by this? You had the point in your presentation as the failure of liberalism order. And I don't understand exactly what do you mean by this. Illiberal liberalism. You've mentioned...
Oh, yeah, okay.
No, it was liberalism. As mentioned...
Okay?
For now.
Yeah, you want me to answer something? Okay, yeah. Okay, I'll try and be as quick as possible. On the whole business of political correctness, this is a fascinating question. And it's a fascinating question because in liberal democracies, it's oftentimes difficult to talk about specific aspects of foreign policy. Amazingly, you see this in the United States. The boundaries of legitimate discourse about American foreign policy are quite narrow in the United States. And anybody who challenges the reigning orthodoxy runs the risk of being marginalized. Right? You get a real groupthink. You would think that would not be the case in a liberal democracy, because liberal democracies, and you were intimating this, are supposed to privilege the marketplace of ideas. And the theory is that we all benefit from having different perspectives and having debates about what is the best way to think about foreign policy. But there are a lot of countries that you go into in the liberal democratic world where you can't talk about certain subjects. If you go to Germany, for example, and you say it would be a good idea if Germany got nuclear weapons, you will automatically be dismissed as somebody who needs to be taken to a mental institution. And that's just one of many examples I could point to. And my view is, to use your rhetoric, it does imprison our mind. It makes it hard to have legitimate discussions about foreign policy and to weed out bad ideas. And there is a surprising amount of political correctness. I don't want to go into this in any great detail, but I could tell you all sorts of stories about the run-up to the Iraq War in the United States. I was, as I said before, one of the leading opponents of the Iraq War in the United States, and I was very outspoken against the Iraq War. And I talked to a good number of people who were opposed to the war, who were afraid to speak out because it was politically incorrect, especially inside Washington, D.C., to oppose that war at a certain point. And people got on board. And the end result is we had a disastrous foreign policy. I could go on and on, but political correctness is a bad thing. You want to have a marketplace of ideas. You want to have an open discussion. And if you disagree with people, you should listen to them. And if you think their arguments are foolish, you ought to knock them down using logic and facts. The woman here asked me the very interesting question, was it liberalism or hegemony that failed? My argument would be it was both. That the idea that the United States could be a global hegemon and dominate the world was a pipe dream. It was just impossible. The world is too big. There's too much variety out there. There's too much water separating us from other areas of the world. So it's impossible to be a hegemon, a global hegemon. And also liberalism fails because it runs into nationalism and realism, as I said. There's also the question of whether or not I said that the United States is or is not a profoundly liberal country. I apologize for not being clear. My argument was that the United States is a profoundly liberal country, right? There's no question about that. Donald Trump notwithstanding. Then I was asked the question of whether or not the post-1815 period bears any resemblance to the period that we're moving into. I would say no, and let me just describe the post-1815 period. Between 1792 and 1815, that's 1792 and 1815, France basically took on the world. Those are the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. 23 years. France was an incredibly powerful country. It took 5 balancing coalitions to defeat the French, okay? At 1792 to 1815. The next big war that involved almost all of the great powers in Europe was World War I in 1914, where basically all of the great powers in Europe, and then eventually the United States, took on Germany. That was Imperial Germany. So between 1815 and 1914, you had remarkably few wars in Europe. You had the Crimean War in 1853, 1856, small war. You had the Italian Wars of Unification, 1859. You had the Austro-Prussian War, 1866, and the Franco-Prussian War, 1870. So there's no European great power war from 1870 to 1914. That's 44 years. There's no great power war in Europe from 1815 to 1853 when the Crimean War breaks out. It's another huge period of peace. And you have no big systemic war like the Napoleonic Wars or World War I. Why is that the case? It's because there's no one power in Europe that can threaten to dominate the entire continent because of its economic and military might. There's no Napoleonic France, there's no Imperial Germany. The world we're moving into now is a very different world because of China. The rise of China in East Asia. China has the potential to become an incredibly powerful country. And the United States, of course, will move to check China. Many of China's neighbors, like Japan, India, and so forth and so on, will try to check China. So it looks like we're going to have an intense security competition in Asia involving the rise of China and China's efforts to dominate Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. So I don't think we have a situation that's analogous to 1815 to 1914, which is one of the most peaceful periods in European history. Final question was illiberal democracy. This is very simple. Liberalism is all about rights. I tried to emphasize that point here. Liberalism is all about rights. Democracy is all about voting, right? And you can have a democracy where the majority rules and violates the rights of the minority. That is an illiberal democracy. And if you look right next door in Hungary, Orban has made it clear that he believes that Hungary is an illiberal democracy. So he is interested in having Hungarians vote on a regular basis, and he is interested in, having a transition in power after one side wins and the other side loses. But he is not interested in a liberal democracy. He advertises that the democracy is going to be illiberal, and that means that there are certain people in that country who are going to be denied basic rights. Remember what I said about liberalism. Liberalism is all about inalienable rights. Liberalism is predicated on the assumption that everybody on the planet has the same basic rights. And once you start talking about denying rights to people who live inside your borders, right, you're talking about an illiberal democracy. And a good example of this would be Israel. Many people will say Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. You can argue that Israel is a democracy, but you cannot argue that, in my opinion, that Israel is a liberal democracy, because the Palestinians don't have the same rights as the Israeli Jews do. So it is an illiberal democracy, not a liberal democracy.
Well, I'd like us to take the next round of questions, and, a gentleman here, but then I'd also like to take a couple of questions from the back of the room. Yeah, so.
Hi, my name is Bogdan Bernaga. I own a pub, basically. So, anyway, picking up on the China thing earlier, you mentioned that, I think last week, you stated that the one factor that could improve US-Russia relations is China. So you reckon there's a chance of a grand bargain between US and Russia, a Yalta-like thing happening in our neck of the woods?
I didn't understand your question.
So with US and Russia getting together, let's say, to contain China,
yes,
you think there's a chance for a grand bargain between the two countries, Yalta-like, like in 1945, in our neck of the woods, here in Romania or Eastern Europe?
Like in 1945.
Question back there. The gentleman in the yellow shirt. There.
Thank you. Okay, here we go. Hello, John. I've had a thoroughly enjoyable time in the US, so love that country. Just so you know where I'm coming from with my question.
If you could just identify yourself.
I'm Gabriel Parra. You've stated that the US wanted to spread liberal democracy after the end of the Second World War. Now, why didn't they start with the Russians? Why did they feed that serial criminal, our country and others, and made communism a reality, instead of offering the Russian troops the option of democracy? I've spoken with a German professor at a conference, and the German High Command actually proposed they fight the Russians. There were 1 million German prisoners, obviously willing to fight. There was a huge veteran army, American and Allied, 10 million soldiers and equipment there and then. But they chose instead to give my country to feed that serial criminal and have their picture taken with their smirks on their faces with the serial criminal, instead of doing the right thing and the easy thing. Because I doubt the Russian soldiers being given the option of democracy would have actually fought for the serial criminal, and they would have rather delivered him, fraternizing with the Allies. So the question in short is, why didn't the Americans give the Russian troops the option of having a liberal democracy rather than have a deal, a dirty deal?
Okay, thank you. Do we have other questions in the room? Okay, you here in the middle.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Cristian Manalaki. I'm a political science student. I'm on my way to write my graduating thesis. I want to write it on the security dilemma subject. So my questions are related to it. Is the Cold War an example of security dilemma? Is the relations between Russia and USA a security dilemma? And can we talk nowadays about a second Cold War, but this time not a global one, but a regional one? Thank you.
Question from this side of the room. Here. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor. My name is Șerban Cioculescu. I'm a lecturer, associate lecturer at the University of Bucharest in political sciences. Tell me, do you think that it's possible to have in the near future a real alliance between Russia and China? I mean, if they could go beyond what they separated them to become allies against the so-called American hegemony? This is the first question. And second, of course, realism, neorealism, they see the evolution of international system as an evolution of the distribution of power in an anarchical system. You have the polarity, you have the change in the paradigm, but what about the possibility that China and Russia really collapse by their internal problem, by the nationalism, by the regionalist tensions, by economic clashes? I mean, they are not indestructible blocks. Something could happen inside these countries, and so all the paradigm would change. So the balance of power system maybe could be also accommodated with such sociological explanation. Thank you.
Okay. The first and second question are both deal with the history of the Cold War. The first question asked whether it's possible for the US and Russia to today form a condominium or to come together and form an alliance against China similar to the one that was formed in 1945 at the end of World War II. And I interpreted that to mean that was when the United States and Russia decided to divide up Europe, or the United States and the Soviet Union decided to divide up Europe, and the Soviets got the eastern part of Europe, which included Romania, of course, and we got the western part. In World War II, it was the Soviet Union that played the key role in defeating Nazi Germany. When the United States finally landed at Normandy on June 6, 1944, less than 1 year before the war ended, at that point in time, 93% of German casualties were on the Eastern Front. 93%. The Soviets lost 24 million people in World War II fighting against the Germans. They built a huge army. And by the time the Red Army got to Berlin in the spring of 1945, it was one very big and very formidable fighting force that had played the key role in defeating Germany. At the same time, the Americans were fighting against the Japanese in the Pacific all by themselves, and they were fighting against the Germans, with, of course, the Russians and the British. When the war ended in May 1945, the war in the Pacific was still raging. And in fact, the United States needed the Soviets' help, or at least they thought they needed the Soviets' help to help defeat Japan. And in fact, the Soviets actually invade Japan in August 1945. I think it's August 8th, 1945, because we needed the Soviets in Asia. So the idea that the United States in the spring of 1945 was going to liberate Eastern Europe by going against, picking a fight with this giant military machine that had just defeated Nazi Germany was not in the cards. And it was not in the cards not only because the last thing the United States wanted to do was fight a war against the Soviet Union, having just fought a war against Nazi Germany. We hadn't finished with the Japanese in the Pacific. So there was zero possibility that the United States was going to rescue, liberate Eastern Europe from the Soviet Union. It just simply was not going to happen. And furthermore, to take this a step further, given that the Soviets had suffered 24 million casualties, that their country had been wrecked by Germany, and that the Soviets had fought against, or the Russians had fought against Germany, not just in World War II, but World War I as well, there was no way they were leaving Central Europe. They were going to stay there to make sure that Germany did not come back from the dead. And that meant that they were going to end up occupying Eastern Europe for a long period of time. This is a tragedy, and it had tragic consequences for the people of Eastern Europe. There is absolutely no question about that. But there is simply nothing the Americans could do about this. The Americans did not have the military might. They certainly didn't have the will to do this. And given the situation in the Pacific, we needed the Soviets to help defeat Japan. Now, the second question from this gentleman on my left talked about giving Russian troops the option of accepting liberal democracy. This is not a plausible strategy. The idea that we could undermine Stalin and the Red Army by offering the troops liberal democracy, which would then spread across the Red Army and into Soviet society, I just think was not in the cards. So the end result, again, is that the United States accepted the basic Yalta Agreement. And I think there was no alternative to that. And again, I don't want to deny for 1 second the tragic consequences, not only for the Romanians, but for the Poles, the East Germans, and everybody else in Eastern Europe, including the Baltic states. It is a tragedy of colossal proportions. But there was really nothing the Americans could do about it. Third question had to do with whether the Cold War was a global security dilemma. When people talk about a security dilemma, what they're basically saying, in my opinion, is that you have two great powers, or two powers, right, that cannot be certain about the intentions of other states. And they cannot be certain about whether the military capabilities that those states have are offensive or are defensive in nature. And therefore, they have no choice but to try to take advantage of the other country. So during the Cold War, just to go back to the Cold War, you had the United States here, and you had the Soviet Union here. We, in the United States, could never figure out what the intentions were of the Soviet Union. We had huge debates about what their intentions were. Did they have benign intentions or malign intentions? People were on both sides of that debate. Furthermore, when we looked at their military capabilities, you could not say that they had defensive capabilities or they had offensive capabilities, because those tanks could be used for offense or defense, the artillery could be used for offense or defense. So the United States could not make sense of whether or not the Soviet Union was a status quo power or it was determined to upset the status quo. And the Soviets, when they looked at us, couldn't make sense of exactly what our intentions were or whether we had offensive or defensive capabilities. And in fact, they understood that our capabilities, our military capabilities, had both offensive and defensive potential. And the end result is we competed with each other because we couldn't trust each other. That, to me, is what the security dilemma is. And I would argue that if China continues to rise, as I said, you're going to get a security competition in Asia that involves the United States and its allies on one hand, and the Chinese and its allies on the other hand, and the security dilemma is going to be alive and well. Both sides are going to not know what the intentions are for sure of the other side, and they're not going to know whether they have offensive or defensive capabilities for sure, right? And the end result is you'll have a security dilemma. So I think when you talk about great power politics, in most cases, what you get are security dilemmas. Finally, there was a question about whether or not you'll get an alliance between Russia and China against American hegemony in the future. I think what we have now is a situation where, as a result of the Ukraine crisis, the United States has pushed the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. From my point of view, it makes very good sense for the United States, to form an alliance with the Russians against China, right? China is a much greater threat to the United States than any other country on the planet. And the United States is going to have a very difficult time containing China. And the United States needs the Russians. And my view is that over time, what will happen is that the Americans and the Russians will move closer and closer together for purposes of containing China. I do not believe, I want to add, that this will have negative consequences for Romania, because the Russians will be looking eastward and southward, and they will not be looking westward in the direction of Romania. In other words, what I'm saying is that when you think about the rise of China and what the consequences are for Russia, it will force the Russians not to look westward at countries like Romania, but to look eastward and southward. The downside of China rising is that the United States will, in all likelihood, move forces out of Europe to Asia to deal with China. And that could result in the demise of NATO. So the rise of China is a mixed bag for Europe and for Romania in particular.
Okay, we're a little bit overboard with the time, so I propose maybe we take one last question and then go with a round of final thoughts through the panel and then wrap up the event, if you agree. One last question? Okay, here in the front seat.
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, for offering us such an opportunity of having a conversation with you, and we have to thank Eugenia Gushilov for organizing such an event. My question is the following one. I haven't introduced myself. I'm Mariana Pegulescu, PhD in contrastive linguistics, still interested in what is happening on an international stage. Do international realities and liberal dreams favor, in a way, a lifelong illusion, just to, in a way, oppose the metaphor of your title? Thank you.
It's a great question to end.
The question is?
Regarding the title of your book, help us summarize again the last part.
Looking at your title, and in fact the subtitle as well.
Yes.
So, do international realities and liberal dreams favor, perhaps, in a way, a lifelong illusion when targeting what is happening on, let's say, a political stage, internationally speaking?
Thank you. I think that when the United States first began to pursue liberal hegemony, we were operating on the assumption that this was going to work out very well, and it was going to benefit people all over the world. And of course, it did benefit some people. That was the point that Eugenia made. But my argument, of course, is that it did more damage than it did good. And I don't think you end up with a lifelong illusion, because I think most Americans now understand that these dreams led to failed policies. My colleague Steve Walt has written a book that's very critical of American foreign policy over the same time frame I'm talking about. His book is also a critique of liberal hegemony, but the title of his book is The Hell of Good Intentions. The Hell of Good Intentions. And Steve's argument is that the policymakers who pursued liberal hegemony were not evil individuals. They were fools. They were fools. You know Talleyrand's very famous statement, it's worse than a crime, it was a blunder, right? This is what we're talking about when we talk about the American foreign policy elite, right? These were people who were remarkably foolish. They pursued what we used to call boneheaded policies. And the fact is, at this point in time, it's quite clear that those policies failed. Again, this is why in part, why Donald Trump got elected, right? Because the American body politic understands that these policies did not work out. And Trump criticized liberal hegemony, as I pointed out in my talk, at almost every turn. And I think most of the liberal hegemonists understand that their grand scheme failed. So I don't think we're talking about lifelong illusions here. But I want to make one final point to you. What happens if in, let's say, 20 years, China begins to fall apart and Russian power continues to decline and the United States gets more and more powerful and we have another unipolar moment? In other words, we have another opportunity for the United States to pursue liberal hegemony. What will happen? Now, my answer to your question is we won't, sort of implies that we won't do it again because we've learned our lesson. You talked about a lifelong illusion. I'm sad to say that it might be a lifelong illusion, and after 20 or 30 years, we'll forget what happened and we'll try liberal hegemony again. I hope that's not the case, but I wouldn't be surprised if your use of the term lifelong illusion is appropriate 20 or 30 years from now.
Yeah. Any last thoughts from our conversation facilitators, from our panel before we conclude, or from you, Professor?
I've
propose
talked too much.
We
Let my colleagues
start from
talk.
that side of the table again.
Thank you very much for a fascinating discussion and for your very thorough answers. My final thought had to do with the fact that one of my main takeaways from your book is just how fragile liberal democracy is, and what we see happening today in places like the United States, where you have attempted crimes or crimes against particular minorities, is a very grim, unfortunately, reminder. But because I don't like to end on a negative note, I'm just sort of curious to know, in your final thoughts, what you think, how you think you can maintain a vibrant democracy and advance those values and those ideas. Thank you.
I have a very similar point. We're equating quite often neoconservative policies with liberal policies when in fact they're not the same. Though they may look, or the discourse that they use may use liberal arguments, but in fact we're talking about not blunders and fools, but by self-interested, clear connection between specific interests that may not be national interests, but they're still our interests, tied into political decision-making. Directly linked to that is the idea that is very present in your book, that one of the dangers to liberal democracy that comes from such a liberal foreign policy is that its failures will then be imported and lead to uber-nationalism, populism, etc., and will undermine internally the credibility of a liberal democratic system with a huge cost for those societies. The opposite is also true. If you completely take out values from the international system, the risk is that the substantial values that are required by a liberal democratic system get so tarnished that the belief that underpins a liberal society will fail to exist.
Well, I'm a bit at a loss because on one hand, for the first time I found myself defending the national interests of another country, not Romania. And my second brief observation is that Professor Mearsheimer normally has the right to have the last word. And so it's a bit strange to give the floor to other panelists.
But he will have the last word.
Then you put my heart at rest then. I'm looking forward to your wisdom, Professor.
I just say two very quick points because I've talked much too much. Eliza asked me the question, what can be done to advance a vibrant liberal democracy? And my answer to her question is very similar to what I would say to Andre's comments. I didn't emphasize this theme in my talk, but I do emphasize this theme in my book. And that is that when you pursue liberal hegemony, you end up pursuing a highly militaristic foreign policy with a great emphasis on fighting wars. And that ultimately undermines liberalism at home. In other words, when you have a national security state that's set up to manage and fight wars all the time, that undermines liberal democracy. So I make clear in the book that one of the principal reasons that I'm opposed to liberal hegemony is because I think it threatens liberalism at home, as paradoxical as that is. So I would say to you, Eliza, to you, Andre, I think one of the best things that the United States could do to foster liberal democracy at home is to pursue a more restrained foreign policy. Final point is, you emphasized the importance of values, and you said if you take out liberal values altogether, you're in real trouble. I agree with that. I'm not against liberal values. I'm not against the United States, right, going around the world, or people in the United States going around the world saying that they think liberal democracy is a wonderful political system and engaging in debates about values. What I'm against is a U.S. foreign policy that is designed to reshape the world in America's image. And in a very important way, it's not a liberal foreign policy because it does not tolerate difference. Remember what I said about liberalism. Liberalism emphasizes inalienable rights, it emphasizes tolerance, and then it emphasizes the importance of having a state. But in a very important way, if you think about it, and this is paradoxical, the United States is not a very tolerant state because it's saying you have to adopt liberal democracy. We have figured out what the approved solution is, and it's my way or the highway. And that's what disturbs me. I'm not against proselytizing about the virtues of liberal democracy. I've tried to make it clear that I consider myself to be a liberal Democrat, and I'm thrilled that I grew up in a liberal democracy. But I'm not interested in ramming that down the throats of other people, especially if that means using military force. Because to go back to my first point, what that ends up doing is undermining liberal democracy at home.
Well, there is nothing left for me than to thank Professor Mearsheimer for being here today, for answering our questions, for his presentation. A special thank you goes also to our three wonderful conversationalists, conversation facilitators, as well as to our partners for this event, and to all of you for coming and for asking questions. With this, I think we can conclude our event. And there is one more part left, that is the book signing. And just to give you instructions, we have a small table on the left side of the podium, and I kindly ask you to form an orderly line so that Professor Mearsheimer can sign you the copy of the book.
Take advantage of this.